Good evening. My name is Wyatt Shields. I'm the city manager. Thank you all for coming tonight. Tonight's meeting will be taped, and it's being televised, and we'll broadcast it on our local access TV station on the website as well. So I want to thank our local TV. Tonight is a chance to get public input on decisions that the City Council will make next Monday night on Monday the 24th relating to the capital improvements program. What the council will be considering is an ordinance to authorize a referendum for the George Mason High School, as well as amendments to the CIP to incorporate the high school into the capital improvements program. There have been discussions. I have made proposals to the City Council for modifications to the CIP. We'll describe those tonight. And really the purpose of tonight's meeting is, one, to inform, and two, to get input. And we have a number of City Council members and school board members, as well as other board and commission members who are here tonight, and they want to hear what your questions are and hear your comments. And that's helpful for them as they're moving towards some of these decisions on Monday night. Mayor Tarter, would you like to make a few welcoming remarks as well?
Sure. Thank you. First off, thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. I know it's a summer, it's hot outside, but we've got some really important things to be thinking about and working on the next couple months. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce a few of my colleagues from City Council. Vice Mayor Mary Beth Conley in the back, Letty Hardy, and Phil Duncan. I understand Dan Z's at a board and commission meeting, but he'll be joining us a little bit later on. But as you'll see later this evening, as you probably already heard, there's a lot on our plates collectively as far as capital improvements go and financially, trying to figure out how to pay for all these things. And so this is a really important discussion. We want to bring as much information to you as soon as possible so that we can all make informed decisions and share collectively in what we're going to undertake. You're also going to hear a little bit more about the campus project. And as we promised throughout this process, we're trying to give as much information to you as possible, make the process as open and transparent as we can so that voters can be informed should there be at the referendum in November about the school. So, but that's something that we're going to continue to work on. That process, particularly as it relates to the campus and the economics of the campus, are really starting to ramp up right now, but we wanted to share that information with you as soon as possible. One of the things you'll hear about tonight as well is some of the possible tax revenue, which is sort of the other side of the coin. One is how much could you get if you sold it or you did a ground lease, but just as important, if maybe not more importantly, is what's the stream of income you'll get from ongoing real property taxes or restaurant taxes or hotel taxes. So that's a discussion we want to start bringing out to you as well. I think you should keep in mind that the tax revenue you hear about tonight is based on one view of what might happen up there. And that view can be changed if we want to direct it in some way. In other words, we don't want as many of these or we want more of these. So those can have different impacts. What you're going to hear about tonight is one possible scenario that I think is market realistic, but we may still want to change that. But that's a discussion, a community discussion that we think we want to have in terms of, what do we want to see up there and how might that impact the fiscal benefits or the fiscal analysis, ultimately that project. So a lot on our plates. I'm glad that you all are here with us tonight. It's the beginning of a discussion, the beginning of a dialogue. It will be continuing, but I think this is a great start. So thank you all for coming out this evening and look forward to your questions and your input.
Thank you, Mayor Tarter. The chairman of our school board, Mr. Lawrence Webb.
Thank you, Mr. Shields. I also want to join and welcome you all here this evening. This is a very important opportunity for us to hear what's going to be happening with our side of it, the school. This is a project that has been a long time in the works, and I know it's a huge venture that we as a city will be undertaking. But I believe between what we've been working with our partners in the city, as well as what we've been doing on our side, working to get the school program the right size for us. But we are also looking at what has been put up by Perkins Eastman and looking at potential ways that we can potentially have some cost savings off within that project as well. And so we recognize what we're asking is a huge something for our city to undertake, but City of Falls Church is a community that was started because of our school system. And I think as we move through this process, looking at the economic development part of it, looking at how we're going to lay out the process of our citizens and the taxes that are going to be a very important part of this, making sure this is affordable for us. But on our side, it's looking at it from the perspective of we have world-class schools. Our high school currently is in a state of major repair. We need facilities that match the teaching that happens there, but we also need those 21st century facilities for our students to go in, learn, and be safe in as well. But I do look forward to your questions, because I know you all have a lot of them. And there's still points with us where asking questions and making sure that as this process moves forward, that we get those questions answered and get those responses to you all as soon as possible. I want to also acknowledge my colleague, Aaron Gill, who's in the audience tonight. But we are working, we're listening to folks in the community tonight, but also please reach out to us in other times if you have questions that may come up. I mean, you may not think of tonight, but please reach out to us and ask us questions, because we're in this together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Webb. So in terms of our program for tonight, we'll start with a presentation by Dr. Peter Noonan, and that will be an update on the school feasibility study. And then I will go through an introduction to financing for the project. We're joined by Kiran Bawa, the city's Chief Financial Officer. She will go through our debt service projections for this project and what it means in terms of impacts on the average taxpayer in the city. From that, we want Q&A. We will use microphones for Q&A, and when we do get to, and that's really for the sake of the television audience, and when we do get to Q&A, we'll ask you to identify yourself by name and address, and the goal really is to get as many questions or comments out as possible. So we'll try to be efficient in our presentation so we have time for that aspect of tonight's program. Dr. Noonan.
Thank you, Mr. Shields. Good evening, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here so far. Just kidding. I was saying to somebody earlier tonight that this is my 9th week on the job, and I'm still sort of counting it in weeks, and I figure as long as I count it in weeks, I've got a fallback position. But it wasn't exactly the glide path that I was expecting when I came into the City of Falls Church. But glad to be here and glad to serve as your superintendent of schools. I am very excited about the work ahead and very excited about this project. So I know that tonight's plan is to get to the Q&A and to some of the feedback as quickly as possible. So I'll work through the slides that I have relatively quickly. Many of you have seen some of these slides before, so I won't linger on too many of them, but I do have a couple of new slides in the presentation that come from some renderings that Perkins Eastman has shared with us. And I think it's a nice sort of conceptual idea of what the building could look like. So with that, let me just begin sort of echoing what Chairman Webb had mentioned, and that is that when we think about school buildings, one of the things that we are trying to pay very close attention to is how do we meet the needs of 21st century students. And I say that sort of cautiously because we're 17 years into the 21st century, so if we're going to do that, we need to kind of get on with it, right? And so one of the things we know is that in our buildings, for us to adequately meet the needs of students, to be able to critically think, problem solve, collaborate, communicate effectively, we need to be able to provide an instructional program that provides space and movement and opportunities for collaboration that we don't currently have in our buildings. Additionally, we're preparing kids for careers and career pathways that we don't even know exist yet, or maybe don't even exist yet. So for us to be nimble and flexible in our instructional programming, we need to have a building that also matches that need. We understand from the research that high quality school buildings actually correlate to high quality outcomes, and that's in academics and it's in health outcomes and the like, and stress outcomes. So the sooner we can move out of a building that currently is highly stressful for our kids, I think, in many ways, and get a building that matches the quality of education that happens in those buildings, I believe we're going to be better positioned as a school system now and into the long term. And when I mention the long term, one thing I want to be really clear about is that we are making a plan that's not a 10-year plan, it's not a 20-year plan, but really is a 30-plus year plan. And so we are building a facility. Our hope is that we're building a facility that will meet our needs long into the future. Here's one thing that we are committed to as we are looking at that sort of goes to that point. And the first is that, we're assessing all of the facility needs that we have across the system. And in our small city, we have 5 buildings, Thackeray all the way up to George Mason. And we know that there are some critical pinch points, if you will, when it comes to enrollments. And one of those pinch points is at Thomas Jefferson. So we're also looking at Thomas Jefferson, and we're looking at the Mount Daniel project, which I'm excited to say. I think we're going to have trailers coming up the hill in a couple of days, maybe a week. So that will show that we're getting going up there, and I'm really happy about that. And as a consequence of paying attention to those pinch points and thinking about enrollment over time, one of the things we need to do is take a comprehensive look at what our facility planning looks like. And I think what has happened prior to my arrival is we spent a lot of time looking at that long-range plan, and this high school fits into that long-range planning very nicely as it provides space for up to 1,500 students in the high school without too much overutilization of the space, and that feels really good to us. We understand that there is significant risk to this project, and one of the risks is the cost of the new high school. And you're going to hear tonight from Mr. Shields some of the options around financing and ways that some of that can be mitigated through an infusion of revenue from tax revenues and also potentially from the sale of the land or from the ground lease. Our biggest concern from the school side is that if we don't do anything, I really believe that the quality of our educational program here in the City of Falls Church potentially can suffer. And it could impact not only our student outcomes, but it certainly could impact the broader community. As Mr. Webb said, people moved here for the schools and ultimately our property values here in the City of Falls Church. Here are just a couple of new slides, new information pieces for you. That I wanted to squeeze in tonight just to kind of put it on your radar in case the referendum doesn't pass, just to give you a sense of some things that we're going to be looking at that we're going to have to do to the high school. The first is that we're going to need to do a full HVAC or replacement, which would include all the duct work and piping and electrical systems. In the past, we have done some quick fixes to the building, and we can do some of the smaller things, but at this point, many of our HVAC units are leaking glycol and doing a lot of other damage to our building, so we would need to replace that, and that would be between $12 and $14 million to do that replacement, which ultimately could require a bond to begin with. A full roof replacement, we do have a roof that's out of its useful life at this point. We're able to sort of patch it along, and that's been okay until we get really heavy rains. We're looking at exterior doors, flooring replacements, a new elevator, some fire alarms, intercom bell systems, and generators. So immediately, if we don't get to a place where we're successful in this process, we know that there are going to be some costs to the high school between 15 and 17, almost $18 million that'll need to be taken care of in some way or another. These next several bullets sort of indicate what was on the previous slide, but I want to just say that there are a couple other capital needs that also need to be addressed in the not too distant future, but could be immediately deferred. For example, the restrooms in our buildings haven't been upgraded since 93, 94 and are in need of a full gut and renovation. We need new fixtures, new partitions, new paint, and then in our lighting, we would like to upgrade our lighting to replace it with LED. We know that over the life of the building, that will save some operating costs. So just some other things that we could defer out, but put those on your radar just to be thinking about. This is really exciting to me as I think about conceptually what the building could look like. What you see here is the rendering for the new front of the building. This came from Perkins Eastman earlier this week. And just to orient you to the front, that is actually facing east towards the giant shopping center. And there would be a street here to the right, over on this side, that would be coming down, and I'll show you more of a map in a second. But this front entrance becomes what is known as the heart of the school, or the commons area, if you will. And then to the left, over on this side, would be the theater space and the cafeteria, and to the right would be the gym areas. But certainly a much different look and feel than what we currently have on our George Mason site. To revisit this, just to remind everybody, I'm sure all of you have seen this previously, but just as a reminder, this is actually the community school site plan. And here on this piece at the bottom is the existing Mary Ellen Henderson site. We would connect with the Mary Ellen Henderson site right about the middle. That's where the cafeteria is. And then we would move into the new George Mason. This long extended area that goes out towards the softball and baseball fields is called the Academic Bar. That would be a 5-story building with a majority of the core content classrooms. And I'll show you another slide. And then we'd have our gym, we'd have our cafeteria, and other more common spaces that could also be available for community use. And here on this, this rendering, you'll see this field between the high school and the middle school and the proposed new development. And then that would capture those 10 acres of land, which is tonight what we're going to be, what's part of the fiscal planning process. So another sort of massing of the buildings to give you a better sense too. And this is if you were at, I don't know, 150 feet, 200 feet above University of Virginia, Virginia Tech campus, this is what you would see. Here you'd see the academic bar, and then this would be the new commons area. I think what's interesting about this, and let me back up just a second, I'm sorry, is that this street would potentially be called School Street. This is right off Haycock Road. This is the existing street that's there, and that would come down and it would go right into that commons, the proposed commons area or the front of the high school. And we would look to develop some sort of road that would cut through the campus as well. One clarifying point about the WMATA Ring Road that comes this direction, after speaking with Perkins Eastman, this parking lot would actually connect with the Ring Road for easy access out onto this area that could then loop back towards Falls Church City. This is an eye test. You won't be able to see this, but this gives a little bit more information if you wanted to pull it down off of the website where it'll be posted to see. But this gives you a little bit more sense of what the floor plans look like. And it shows in there where different content areas potentially could go. There's an area for our High C program, that's our online program. There's areas for interdisciplinary planning and cross-curricular planning. And there's also a green terrace that is part of the plan in this conceptual drawing. And here you'll see some of those common spaces. This is our full-sized main gym that would be the addition. Here we've got some other areas. We've got the dining area here, the auditorium here, and then the administrative building would be as you come in to that main area to the right. All right, so come on. I want to move. Maybe that's because that's the end. So that gives you a sense of what we're conceptually looking at. One of the things that we've been able to share with the council that I've been able to work with the school board on rather significantly is the overall cost of the building. There are two types of costs that are associated with building a building of this size. The first is the actual construction costs. Those are called the hard costs, and then there are soft costs that are associated with that, and that would be furniture, fixtures, and FF&E, furniture, fixtures, and equipment. And that would be if you took a building, turned it upside down, and shook it, everything that falls out, it would be those furnitures, fixtures, and equipment. And it also includes the engineering and the architecture pieces as well. The overall cost of this building and hard costs is approximately $110 million. And then the soft costs would be approximately $10 million for a total of $120 million. As I say that, and as I prepare to turn the microphone over to Mr. Shields, one of the things that I also want to say is we've looked very closely at ways that we might be able to save some money in this construction. And there are a number of places without value engineering this building that we believe we can come in under the $120 million. I'm a little bit nervous to say that we would ask for less, but what I am committed to say is that as we get into the process, we are committed to looking at every possibility that actually would bring this building in for less than $120 million, which ultimately could impact the long-term financial planning for this. I don't know if we could get it to 110, but I'm pretty confident that we can get it to close to 115. Additionally, another piece of the puzzle for us is how operational costs play into this. We do know that as our as our enrollment grows, that our operational costs are going to go up as well. We have projected out over the next 10 years, roughly 4% growth in those operational costs, which is rather significant over time. And as kids come in, we need to provide for them. But we are also committed from a school side, and I hate to call it sides because I think we're all in this together, but from the operational side of the schools, we are also committed to looking at those long-term operational costs and figuring out ways that we can find efficiencies, effectiveness, and do some constraining of those costs. Somebody today characterized it as a diet. I'm not a big fan of diets, as you might tell, but we would be interested in looking at how we might be able to reduce some operating costs in the long term as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Shields, and he will talk about the financing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Noonan. Thank you, Cindy. Cindy is the Deputy City Manager, and she manages our capital improvements program as it goes through our process, and was before the Planning Commission on Monday night as well, having this same discussion with the Planning Commission. So I will go off of this screen as well, and again, this is going to be kind of a tag team with me and Ms. Bawa. I will forewarn you that the pleasant part of tonight's presentation is now over, and so we'll talk now about how we pay for this. So as I noted earlier, Monday night, the City Council will discuss and take action on an ordinance for the referendum. What is before the Council is a referendum for $120 million for George Mason High School. In addition, the CIP amendments, and we'll discuss with you today the full CIP and what that costs, and the modified CIP, which is a proposal that staff has brought forward for the Council's consideration. In terms of the timeline, if this referendum is going to be on the ballot this fall, we need to get it to, the Council really needs to take action in July in order to get it to the court for that to be authorized. Here's the question that will be on the ballot, and it's kind of your standard question. Under Virginia law, the only issue that can be submitted to the public for a referendum is a question of indebtedness. And so that's the way this question is phrased. Shall the City of Falls Church, Virginia contract a debt and issue its general obligation bonds in an aggregate principal amount not to exceed $120 million for the purpose of paying the costs incident to constructing, expanding, reconstructing, renovating, equipping, or re-equipping in whole or in part. Now the lawyers are starting to get involved. The high school or the middle school in the City of Falls Church, and then the voter would say yes or no. So that's the question that if the Council approves this ordinance on Monday night, that's the question that would be on the ballot next fall. Now I'll turn it over to Ms. Bawa for a discussion of the city's current debt and debt projections.
Good evening, everyone. Kiran Bawa. So looking at it by way of background, City currently has an outstanding debt of $51.2 million, and for which the City is paying $6.2 million annually in debt service, which is roughly 8% of our annual budget here, which also translates to 16 cents on the tax bill, real estate tax bill. The breakdown of the $51 million in total debt for school versus the general government is roughly a 28 to 72% ratio. The current CIP program, the city does a 5-year CIP, so we have one from fiscal year 18 all the way to fiscal year 22, which was adopted a few months ago. And that has an outstanding debt requirement of $33.2 million for various projects as listed on the screen for the library, city hall, and some miscellaneous projects. In addition to that, the school has approached us for funding of the George Mason High School renovation, and the Thomas Jefferson has not been included in the 5-year CIP. However, everybody realizes it'll be a need down the road. So we are building that into the full CIP model at $15 million. Including those two, the city is required to look at a debt of a little less than 170 million in the near future to fund its current CIP needs. And on the right is the chart which shows in the blue bar as the current debt, which is 51 million, and with assuming new debt of roughly 170 million, the city is looking at multiplying its debt situation 4 times in the near future should we go for the full CIP and fund all these projects. As Mr. Noonan just went over the community school option that is being preferred by it's the preferred option by the school board. The construction cost is 110 million, including the soft costs and some mitigation efforts to reduce the cost and the financing cost of the debt. We are looking at a bond referendum of 120 million for this project. And I will turn it back over to Mr. Shields.
In 2013, the city sold the water system, and as part of that, there was a boundary adjustment that brought the high school campus into the city. And we began at that time considering, we knew we needed some investment in our school facilities, and so we began considering whether economic development could help pay for that. And we've had many meetings with the development community. We've had lots of discussions with Fairfax County, with VDOT, with our neighbors to the north, UVA and Virginia Tech. As you may recall, we received a proposal in 2014, or 2015, an unsolicited proposal to do a public-private partnership where a portion of the land would be turned over for private development, and the private partner would build the high school for us. We also issued an RF. We didn't accept that unsolicited proposal. It was not for a free high school, just so everybody is clear about that. It was a very complicated proposal, but it did encourage us to go to the market and ask for a competitive process. Let's see if we get multiple proposals for that basic concept. We got 2 responses to that RFP. Under Virginia law, they had to be considered in closed session in a confidential process to protect the proprietary information that was in those proposals. And at the end of the day, partly because of that process, which was difficult to do that in closed session, and 2, we just didn't get what we were looking for in terms of the competitive responses. We've also done studies. The Urban Land Institute did a panel on the site, and we recently completed the Perkins-Eastman study for the school feasibility. And we've also had a land valuation study by the firm of Alvarez and Marcel. And some of the summary of the findings of those studies were the $120 million school, which is where we have arrived, potentially less, but we think that's the upper value. A land value of for the 10 acres for commercial development, we're advised between $43 and $45 million under a structure of either a fee simple sale or a lease. And we have calculated based on a program of one scenario of economic development of a net tax yield, and so taxes that would above the cost that would be associated with development of approximately $3.1 million about 10 years after the project is, after the transaction, so 2031. So what the program is, and this is very similar to what the Urban Land Institute came forward with in 2014. Our current consultant, Alvarez and Marcel, have tweaked that program. But here's the basic idea. About 30% of the uses would be commercial. About 70% of the uses would be residential. It is their view that in terms of taking the land to market for something that the market would want to build and pay full fair market value for, that's probably roughly a ratio that we could expect. So you break out the square footages as shown in this chart. It's just under 1.1 million square feet of development. So what that means is buildings that are between 5 and 10 stories tall, mixed-use structures likely, probably a standalone office building, a standalone hotel, residential, ground floor on, retail on the ground floor, entertainment uses mixed in. That's what our consultants and what the ULI and also, frankly, what the market through our conversations with developers have said that's likely what wants to be built here from a market perspective. So that's a summary of some of the findings, and now we'll discuss our financing. And so I'll turn it back over to Ms. Bawa and then take it back for a little bit of the discussion of the tax shield.
So before you have a graph which shows the debt service for funding of $218 million worth of projects, the capital improvement projects that the city is considering. So I'll start with the bottom left. This blue here is the existing debt. If the city were to issue no further debt, we would be done in fiscal year 2036. This blue is the current debt. Right above that is the purple, which is the miscellaneous general government projects that are part of the current 5-year CIP. Some smaller miscellaneous projects, voting equipment and other equipment here, and the fire station, yeah, not the fire station, the shooting range, sorry. And I'm not sure if you're seeing these colors as they were intended to be, but this is a light pink, and right where the pointer is, and that is the debt service for funding renovation of the city hall, which is going to expected to be 11.7 million issuance in fiscal year 18. And the next layer over, the light green, is the funding for the library. Also, issuance in this issuance is in fiscal year 19, and for 8.7 million, as per the referendum that was passed a few years ago. The solid red bars is the debt service for the George Mason High School, and that's 120 million over a 30-year level debt loan. This orange is funding for debt service for the Thomas Jefferson Elementary School. We're modeling this in fiscal year 2020 in this situation. However, it's not part of the CIP. I'm just repeating that for everybody's benefit. In the out years, we are showing, including in our modeling, a 5 million issuance every other year for miscellaneous projects that may come up after we have reached a point where we are within our threshold. And finally, I'd like to talk about this line, which shows the city's policy of its debt service as a percentage of its total expenditures on an annual basis. The city has a policy of having that number stay within 12%. Industry practice is somewhere between 8 and 12%, and we are within that range. So this purple line is what that shows. So with the full CIP debt service model, you can see there will be a few years where we are expected to exceed that policy. This shows a total of 170 million, 167.5 million issuance within the first 2 years to align with the timeline of the projects and as the funding is needed. The project is expected to have, we currently have a $10 million capital reserve. And also there is a, as Mr. Shields mentioned, there is a likelihood of 43 to 45 million in land sale proceeds. We're modeling 40 million for that. And with that 50 million, the true impact to the general fund would be within the policy a little below this line. So those are the triangles that you see here that kind of show what the impact would be to the general fund contribution towards that debt service. So some of the underlying assumptions for the chart that you just saw, George Mason High School is showing, we are modeling that as issuance for this fiscal year for $120 million level debt. And City Hall and other CIP projects, which include the fire shooting range, voters equipment, there are some transportation grant funding match, and park planning studies, one of the master plan. Those are also in there, and those would be issued, the year of issuance for those is also fiscal year 2018 at the amounts mentioned, but those are 20-year debt issuance. The library to be issued in fiscal year 19, and Thomas Jefferson modeled here at $15.3 million in fiscal year 2020. The issuance of this large debt, we are working with our financial advisors and trying to see that we're modeling whatever is most prudent with the given economic landscape out there. We are using interest rates from somewhere between 3.5% to 5%. The issuance is being considered in over 3 years in 3 tranches. Trying to align with the cash flow requirement of the projects to cover the A&E and other planning design needs in the first issuance of 15%, 45% where the crux of the funding would be required when the construction starts, 45% in the second year and the remaining 40% in the year after. The school is expected completion of the community is, I think, June 2021. So how does all that boil down to an impact on the tax payers? So this chart shows the impact on a median homeowner tax bill. That's the y-axis you're seeing in dollar amounts, and the years, we're trying to model about 20 years here. If we were to assume a situation where the land sale proceeds are uncertain and remain to be seen whether they would happen or not. The blue line models the situation where we assume is without any land sale proceeds. And that would translate to roughly about $900 additional impact on a median homeowner tax bill, and that is at $665,000 average parcel price, just for modeling sake, starting in next March, 13-cent increase. And if we were to include consider the $40 million from the land sale proceeds and the $10 million that we have in the reserves now, that mitigates the impact to 9 cents. Starting next year immediately. Going further down.
I'll do just a quick discussion of how we model the tax yield. So as we've indicated, we've got 10 acres of land potentially going into economic development with about 1.1 million square feet of commercial development. So we've modeled here that in 2022, we would start to get a tax, or if it's a lease, a payment in lieu of taxes, starting then just on the raw land. And then by 2025, 1/4 of the land would be developed. So we have about 1/4 of the net fiscal impact coming online of $797,000, and then it gets phased in over the next 8 years to what we're calling a stabilized net fiscal impact of $3.1 million. We're keeping the dollars constant. We're not increasing them for inflation. And this is meant to be net fiscal impact. And so in rough numbers, the gross revenue is projected from the 10 acres is about $7 million. The costs associated with school kids, with police, with parks and recs, anything that comes from new residents and the commercial development, about $4 million. We've modeled between 100 and 150 students would be generated from the economic development on this site if it had that mixed use, that 70-30 mixed use component. And that's based on what our actuals are in the city that we've seen in this up to date. So that's just a quick summary of how we're considering tax yield on the site. There are a ton of assumptions here. A lot of them are arguable, but I just want to explain what those projections are.
Assuming those tax yields in our model, including that this next chart shows the impact on a revised and revised downwards, because the tax yields are helping to pay part of the debt service. So revised impact to the median homeowner, it drops from, in the previous slide, it was $600. Here with the land sales, it drops to $400 on an average starting next year's tax bill. And this blue line remains the same. It's assuming no land sales, so I'm going right to the red line, that's why. So a 6-cent real estate tax and tapering downwards as we move along the life of the debt. And this just shows, I'll just toggle back and forth so you can see this chart is without the tax yield, starting at 600, moving along in that ballpark, and including the tax yield impact mitigated down to $400 and to $300 range, and then dropping further down in fiscal year 38 as we get to paying a big chunk of the debt by that time. I'll turn it over to Mr. Shields to talk about the various risks.
So staff brought forward a modified CIP, and the reason for that is really the crux of our financing plan does depend on a third party entering into an agreement for the sale or lease of the land on the campus site, and then developing it in a reasonably timely fashion. So that carries with it a lot of market timing risk. Because of the size of the obligations, we have the potential of a credit downgrade. Because of the scale of this capital project, there's cost control risk. We also have operating costs. Now let me just speak a little bit about operating costs. We are modeling a capital program here. We're not even building into it cost pressures that are on the operating side. So with all of those costs of the homeowners that were just shown on the board, that assumes that the City Council balances the budget each year without tax rate increases. And we're not trying to argue that one way or the other. What we're trying to present is a capital financing plan. The operating budgets is a separate issue. We do multiple year operating budget forecasts each year with the budget, and we'll do them again this September with our year-end financial report. But here we're just trying to focus, this is what the cost of the capital program is, and that's really what our analysis is intended to do. So in terms of reducing some of those risks, essentially what it comes down to is taking about $30 million of the capital improvements program and pushing it out to the year 2022, which is when notionally this land transaction is expected to occur. So if the land transaction occurs on time and things are going swimmingly, that's when we can reconsider other capital improvements projects like the TJ Elementary School, like the library. Those are the two really big ones that are being proposed here to be delayed. So the George Mason High School, there'd be no changes to it. The City Hall, and there's been a lot of discussion about that versus the library, or really any of these projects versus the other. What we're putting forward is a basic proposition that that we do have a lot of debt, obviously, in the capital improvements program. That some of these, from a risk mitigation perspective, we would propose we would wait until after the land transaction. The library, we do escalate the cost. If this option were taken, we escalate it at a rate of 5% per year when that would occur in FY22. And then TJ Elementary School, we just took the high end of the estimate for that project at 15.3. The range for TJ was 10 million to 15 million, so we just took the high number there. And so I'll turn it back to Ms. Bawa in terms of how that then looks in terms of impacts on debt service and tax bills.
So here you're seeing a graph which models the modified CIP with the assumptions that Mr. Shields just listed, delaying a few projects out and aligning it more with the availability of the land sale proceeds funding. Again, just quickly going over this blue, light blue is the current debt service that we're seeing, 6.2 million that we're paying annually and tapering off in the late 30s. The dark blue or purple has shrunk a little, and as we move some of the projects out, worth 5 million to 2025 and beyond, the City Hall issuance remains in fiscal year 2018 at the anticipated price that we have right now, the bond issuance. The red is the George Mason debt service at 120 million, 30-year. And Thomas Jefferson, as you'll see right here, has been pushed to 2025 issuance, starting debt service in 2026. We are able to have reserves from the increments from the homeowners' tax bill to advance the funding of the library. Instead of 25, advance it to 2022 and 23, and at 10.7 million at that time, including the escalation cost. And as you'll see, again, this purple line is the 12% debt service to total expenditure policy line. And in this scenario, we are exceeding the policy line, however, in just 4 or 5 years. The other one was 7 years, to up to about 17%. This is the highest one is 14% here. And the purple triangles show the true impact of this debt on debt service on the policy, to the policy. So it's much within the policy. As mentioned before, this. Sure. So we have 10 million in capital reserves, and we are expecting 43 to 45. We're modeling at 40 million land sale proceeds. So that 50 million is basically reserve cash that we will use towards making our debt service payments. So the top portion of these bars is roughly showing that 50 million. So the true impact to the general fund making a contribution is at that. If we were to draw a line, it goes through that. Get it? Okay. Again, so aligning these projects with the availability of funds, more so the land sale proceeds, brings the tax impact chart up again with the modified CIP. You may recall the other one started at 400. Again, the blue line is assuming there are no land sale proceeds, which is modeled at $500 on a median homeowner tax bill starting next March. And assuming that we, relying on the availability of the land sale proceeds, will be expecting the median homeowner tax bill to escalate by roughly $300 next March, equivalent to roughly 4 cents. Escalating up because we are aligning certain projects at later, so this is a line that kind of moves up, unlike the other one that's where all the debt is upfront and moves downwards. Incorporating the tax yield, the 3.2 million tax yield that'll start full 100% in fiscal year 2031, brings the impact down from $300 to $200 per median homeowner tax bill starting next March. And going steady on 2 cents for the remaining next 15 years or so for the debt service payments. In this chart, we are modeling, this yellow line shows modeling paying down the debt once we have the availability of 40 million in land sale proceeds. We use that fund to bring our debt down. So instead of roughly 120, the debt would go down to 80 million. However, it has a higher impact on taxpayers, more upfront, and then it tapers off completely in the next 10 years or so, versus this red line, which is kind of a gradual impact that continues. So it's just how we structure the debt. So there are two ways of looking at it in this scenario. Just for comparing some affordability matrix with the region, we have a few slides for you to look at some of the metrics here. The next one is debt to assessed value of our here in the properties here in Falls Church. The median for the Northern Virginia median is at 3%. The city has a policy of staying within 5%. And with the current CIP, Falls Church is 1.5%. The full CIP is expected to take this close to a 5% threshold that we have as our policy calls out. And the modified CIP will be at 4%. So this is just to show you and how it aligns with all the other jurisdictions within Northern Virginia region. The next one is the debt service to expenditures. That's the 12% policy that we looked at the line in the various charts. Again, the current CIP that we have debt, or the current debt, we are at, the debt service is at roughly 8%. And with the full CIP, we are expected to go as far high up as 17%. And with the modified CIP to roughly 14%. And in either case, we will be exceeding our policy of 12% here. Debt per capita, interesting metrics here. There is no policy for this metrics. However, you can see how we compare to other jurisdictions, and should we take on this huge debt, there is no doubt that, this is going to go off the chart kind of significantly. It is a huge amount of debt that Falls Church is looking to assume in the near future. So to kind of compare it a little bit more to the household income, this chart shows instead of just the debt per capita, this chart shows the debt to total household income. And there are other jurisdictions that are, kind of comparable. Not as many, however, this is where we are at right now, around 8%, expected to grow to closer to 30% if we go for the full CIP option, and about 25% with a modified CIP option. Future timelines for decision making, as mentioned earlier, on coming Monday, we have our second hearing of the ordinance where the council will vote on which line of direction we're going, full or modified or some version of thereof of that CIP, and which includes the school bond referendum of $120 million and the CIP amendments that we discussed. In August, the attorneys will be filing for the bond measure, and November 7th is the bond referendum for the school at $120 million. And with that, I think we'll open it for questions. And
Thank you all for your attention and your patience as we go through the presentation. So now it's your turn, comments or questions. And so what we'll do is we're going to keep this microphone here for us, and then we'll circulate this one, and Ms. Messer will help. And so if you just raise your hand if you'd like to ask. And again, if you could identify yourself by name and address, and we're going to try to keep track of everybody and have the microphone go in order.
Okay, I'm Sharon Scholler. I live at 1006 North Tuckahoe Street. I've lived in the city since 1979. I'm very excited about the new high school, but I guess the question that I have is, we have the high school projected over a 30-year bonding, and then we have the library and City Hall over a 20-year bonding. And I was wondering if any consideration had been given to also do a 30-year bonding on those two projects.
Structuring the high school as a 30-year debt really is an anomaly for the city, and we're proposing that to make it affordable. But there are costs to doing that. It spreads the costs out. It increases the overall cost to society by structuring it that way. But it does make it more affordable, and particularly in those early years. The city has a financial policy that we tried to have all of our debt structured so that it's paid off in 20 years with level principal payments. So the 30-year is not in line with that policy, as well as doing it level debt as opposed to level principal. There's an important distinction between that as well. Most of us, for our home mortgages, we have that structured as a level payment over 30 years, so that's something we're all familiar with. But in terms of a city that doesn't just buy a house one time, but will have constant needs to repair our infrastructure, structuring it that way so that we buy it down quicker really is important for the future of the city. So it's important for people to know that that's how we're structuring this, and that this high school is going to be with us, and it's going to be on our tax bills for 30 years.
Joan Curry at 513 West Broad Street, the Byron. We're more recent, I should say, residents, but we have lived in Arlington County for about 35 years. I just had two questions. One was, have you estimated what the current operating cost would be for the new school? And is it above the current operating cost for the present school? And secondly, what of the 51 million debt that you currently hold, what is the nature of that debt?
I'll answer that one real quickly, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Noonan for the operating cost question. That debt, that 51 million, 3/4 of that is for school facilities, 1/4 of it's for general government facilities. The biggest piece of that is Mary Ellen Henderson Middle School. But Mount Daniel is in that figure as well. And I think there's some really old debt for, well, actually, TJ's in there. And so those are the big ones on the school side. The community center is still on our books, as well as the fire station is still on our books. And so the community center was done in 2001, so that will be coming off the books in about 4 years.
With respect to the operating costs, we have modeled the operating costs at about a 4% growth over the next 10 years, which is very close to the percentage of growth student-wise, so it almost matches 1-to-1. So over the last 10 years, I believe that our numbers of students have grown by about 43%, and the debts and the operating costs have grown about 46%. So there's a very close correlation with those, so about 4% a year.
Hey, Ross, Litkenhouse, 1105 Seton Lane. Father of 3 daughters, one that's here with me tonight. Question for you guys in terms of the tax revenue that you were expecting. I saw that you had mentioned $3.1 million in net revenue, which seems awfully low considering the fact that, you know, we're going to develop a minimum of 1 million square feet of mixed-use development. I mean, simple math, you know, you look at $400 a square foot on 1 million square feet at the current tax rate, and if we considered a special taxing district over there, even netting out costs of the city with the students, I mean, I think it's important from a messaging standpoint, especially when you put up the per capita debt number, to make sure that we're right on that, because that seems awfully low. I mean, it seems like it should be something closer to 5 million. And the other question I would have in terms of running numbers across both projects is, you know, we talk about a land sale versus a land lease, which the land lease, in terms of having a developer finance that acquisition through us, would give us the ability to generate revenue over a longer period of time, offsetting that debt cost as opposed to taking it right up front. So I guess 2 questions. One, where did we get the $3.1 million per year in revenue? Because it seems low. And then 2, how did you contemplate in those numbers a lease versus the outright sale? Because the lease would offset cost over a longer period of time as opposed to taking that up front and then taxpayers bearing the burden of the cost of servicing the debt on the bonds from year 1.
Well, first on the net fiscal impact analysis, we use the Tischler-Bice model that the city has. So we took the program that was developed by Alvarez and Marcel, which their lens was what do they think the market would have the least resistance to in terms of building. And I'll be frank with you, there was a lot of discussion about that 70-30 ratio. The market wants to be more geared towards the residential side, and on the land transaction side, those commercial uses tend to not contribute to the value of the transaction. But where they do contribute is on tax yield down the road. And so that's an interest of the city. When we go out to solicit proposals, we will not likely put limits on what the market might bring to us because we want to get the best thinking of the market for the property. But we may put some guide rails around it in terms of things like some minimum commercial ratio expectations. We can put some things in the hotel, things that we really want up there, like a full-service hotel or things like that, that the market might not immediately say is what they want to build there, but we can put some parameters there of what we would want. We can also have and we'll have much more community discussion about what those guide rails ought to be. We can also have the discussion about amenities up there, a skating rink or things like that. We know going in that those types of amenities will likely have a negative impact on the value of a transaction, but it might be worth it for the community if they're amenities the community really seeks to have here. In terms of, so we really we used our model. The model is pretty well tested now. We have 18 acres of property that has mixed-use development on it. And so we can truth test the revenue projections. The expense side for things like police or rec and parks uses or that type of thing, it's just modeled because it's very hard to say what, 100 apartments, how many calls of police service, that's very hard to do. But the model is a sophisticated model, and so we try to do that. What we do have a great deal of transparency on now, though, is pupil generation, and we feel pretty confident, at least based on what's happening in the city today, what the pupil generation numbers would likely be based on a mix of uses. So that's, I'd be happy to talk with you in more detail about that. We think the fiscal impact projections are on the conservative side. We would say that. On the other hand, it's a third party that's going to deliver that, and so this whole model is heavily reliant on a third party's performance, and that ought to give us all pause, because if they don't perform, we're at that blue line in terms of tax impact. If they do perform, we're at the red line, and that's really a measure of risk that I think all of us, every taxpayer in the city, ought to be thinking about.
John Lamoni, 304 Great Falls Street. I have two questions, actually.
Let's get your question, then we'll get back in terms of the question about operating costs.
Okay, I have one for you, Mr. Shields, one for you, Mr. Noonan, if I could. From all the discussions I've heard so far, the project is going to involve a lot of additional infrastructural investment for, say, Haycock, Route 7, the street that was on the shown on the presentation, stormwater, sewer, and all that, tearing down the old building. Could you give us a rough estimate of what the cost of all those would be, and clarify that that's not included in the $120 million for the school, nor has it been deducted from the $40 to $43 million that is being estimated for revenues from land sale or land lease? And for Mr. Noonan, I would like to ask, in those school enrollment projections, what kind of assumptions are being made about new developments in the city, or is that based just on the current population of the city?
Be happy to answer the first one. The second one first. And the enrollment projections that we're looking at include the yield of, my understanding, remember I'm new, but my understanding is that the enrollment projections that are part of the calculation include projected enrollments from potential yield from the new construction on the 10-acre site, as well as projects that are projected and have been approved already by the city. So those those projects are those by which we look at the yield. We take that into consideration, and we also look historically at what our growth in population is as well. But we rely, quite frankly, I'll be relying heavily on the demographers that have been hired by the city, Weldon Cooper, to help us with those projections. And as we navigate the waters of projections with them, we'll also be talking about the new growth and development in a variety of areas throughout the city. From the 10-acre site is part of the projections, yes.
Non-approved projects are not included in that.
My understanding is that they're not, but I would like to get some more clarity before I'm completely held accountable for that answer.
A lot of the projections are, as all projections are, Weldon Cooper has sort of a black box that they use in terms of birth rate projections and things like that, but they also looked at what the city's trends are, and the city has had mixed-use development occur in the city with all the projects, the 8 projects that have been built, and that's part of our history. And so when Weldon Cooper does their projections, they assume that that's going to continue, and so that's a way of answering the question that future projects are built into the modeling for the enrollment projections. But we are seeking more clarity from Weldon Cooper on exactly how that's factored in. We believe it is, but in terms of having perfect clarity on how they do that, we do need some more information. Okay, and so I'll answer your question, but we do want to come back to your question on operating costs. So you had asked about the cost of infrastructure on the site. The $43 to $45 million lease or purchase price assumes that the private sector is going to handle all infrastructure: stormwater, water, streets, sidewalks, streetscape, and all that type of thing. And so that is the purchase price is net of those expenditures that the developer would take. That is the market way. That is the normal way that a transaction for a 10-acre site would be handled. We also expect that the roads will likely stay in private ownership and that they would maintain them going into the future. These are all things that we are subject to future negotiations, but that also would be a fairly normal way that these things could be structured as well. Now, the operating cost. Answered it. Okay, good.
Leslie Rye, 214 Lawton Street. First, it's more of an observation on the calendar. We look at the timing for the proposed school, and we look at the loss of field space, and we look at postponing Larry Graves Field farther down the line. I see a little crisis situation there, and I think we need to relook at that timing in terms of the increased younger population and the school programs and the city's recreation programs. That's more of a calendar observation, not a pro or con anything. And I had a second question, but I lost it in the back and forth over there with that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Terry Zawacki in Tollgate Way. As someone who moved here when my son was grown, so I didn't move here for the schools, I'm wondering about the assumption that you said, Dr. Noonan, that people are moving to Falls Church for the schools. I'm wondering how we know that that is the case, particularly given our proximity to Metro and the fact that the city is becoming a much more vibrant place to live.
I'll be honest with you that assumption comes from the interviews and the people that I've had a chance to talk to since I came 9 weeks ago. And to be clear, the people that I'm talking to typically have students in the schools. However, I am talking with boards and commissions. I've read the history of the school system and why it became its own school system was to break away and create its own school system in the 40s. So a lot of that is just, I can't say it's validated through a study, but I can say that definitely I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people and store owners who have sort of also said that to me.
I'm Monica Freese. I'm 415 Poplar Drive. I wonder if you can speak to a little bit, I know you gave us the costs of if we don't pass this bond, what are kind of the immediate costs that we would face, and those were in the $20 million range. But I wondered if you could speak to kind of the longer term, maybe 10-year horizon of what costs we would face for the high school. I know I've been in that high school, I've seen pictures of it, and just the ability for students to even walk in the halls, you feel it. They are constrained, it's getting tight. And as we have those pupil increases and just we expect the schools to grow, and we would have to do something to address that. And my understanding is the only way to address it is to add on to the school, and then you lose the ability to kind of make use of that development. So I think the picture of, if we don't, kind of bite the bullet and pay for this high school now, we still have, those other issues aren't going away, and how would we deal with those?
Yeah, it's a great question. What I did present tonight were just some of those immediate operational costs, or capital costs, but certainly didn't have anything to do with the growth of our population. And we are looking at, as part of our planning process, to build this high school to accommodate 1,500 students, because we are looking at the out years and to looking at 2030, and we are seeing numbers in the area of about 1,400 students by 2030. If we were to get to that number without doing anything at the high school, we would be at critical mass, and to the extent that we would need to either put on some sort of addition or do some sort of larger potting of portable classrooms out in all the parking lots. We'd lose potentially a lot of our space. In theory, we could start taking some of our fields to put some of those in. So I think that there's a definite need, not only at the high school, for that kind of look, but we're seeing also that pinch at Thomas Jefferson, and we're going to see that group of students coming up in the next 5 to 10 years. So we're going to feel that pinch at the high school sooner rather than later. So I think it's a good point. We already are recapturing space in the old portion of the building in the front, down at the corner of Haycock and Route 7, that is being used for classroom space now that had once been reserved for other purposes, and so we're starting to feel it.
Ed Salzberg. I live at 1006 North Tuckahoe Street in Falls Church. She still lets me live there. I had a question about the different ratios that you had up there, the debt indices, debt to population, debt to income, and it was the full CIP. Did that have the 40 million subtracted out of it? Because it looked like we got way out of line. So if you subtract that out, then that line does come back to the left quite a lot. And also, if you kind of amortize the income from the businesses on that 10 acres, you could sort of get it a little bit more to the left as well. So, you probably want to put that, I would just say you probably want to put that in too, because it looks a little worse. It's very scary looking at that, but it's not so scary if you knock a third of that out or move the line back. And then also I saw Manassas Park was way up there too, and I was wondering if we knew anything about why their ratios were so high. Is there something going on there that we might look at as an analogy or something along those lines?
Manassas Park embarked on a very significant capital campaign in the early aughts from 2001 through 2005. And a lot of that, in terms of how it's an instructive case, a lot of that was they took on, they built a new police station, they built new schools, and other facilities. And part of that was based on some assumptions, because what was happening at that time was these rapid increases in assessed value, and then the recession happened. And that became a very painful situation for Manassas Park. They also have a much lower assessed value there, so that's why their ratios look pretty tough. Their tax rate was $1.64 for about 5 years. It's $1.55 right now. So we do try to learn from our neighbors. The city of Fairfax, on the other hand, they took, as sort of another nearby story, they built a new police station, a new city hall, a new high school, library. They did a lot, and about the same time period, and they accomplished it all with no increase in their tax rate. And the rating agencies have really viewed them as a very solid credit through that entire process. So it's kind of a tale of two cities, and I think that's, we're trying to do this the right way. We understand that these capital needs exist. It is a lot of risk and a lot of obligation we're taking on, and we're trying to do it in a very prudent and very transparent way, so that we don't have the Manassas Park situation.
Thank you. Ira Kalin, 429 Park Avenue. For Dr. Noonan's benefit, I was on the City Council from 2010 to the end of 2013. And I was also the chair of the Budget and Finance Committee and the chair of the Economic Development Committee. So I have some exposure. Regarding the issue of the 30 million, the level principal versus level debt, it doesn't make, this level debt isn't more affordable, it's more expensive. It just smooths out the cash flow to hide the actual cost. Now, the mortgage fine is interesting, but we can't deduct interest payments from our costs. So it does us no good whatsoever other than to smooth over and to make things look that they cost less. So it is not more affordable. It just reconfigures the pain of when we have to pay back. And it's about, for this, I told you last time, it's about $30 million more over the life of the debt for doing it over 30 years. As regards the question about why couldn't we do it all, I called all of the CFOs in all of the jurisdictions to find out how they fund their schools. What do they use? Everybody uses 20 years level debt, level principal. We're the only ones who will be using 30 years level debt, just to get the record straight on that. As far as the numbers and projections, actually I think you guys did a pretty good job. The numbers make sense to me. And I do thank Dr. Noonan for providing the operating cost estimates over the period through 2030. That is very helpful. Now, what's lacking, and I think many of us would like to see, is two more tables. One that goes full CIP plus operating costs, full cost. Because we don't get a tax bill that's broken down by CIP. We get a tax bill that covers everything. Then another table that goes full CIP plus operating costs plus city expenses and city growth, so that people understand what it is we're going to be paying in a number of years. Right now, it's sliced and diced in a way that obscures the actual cost that people are going to have to pay. And to the point of the individual who mentioned that they came in after their children were through school, I did the same. My kids had graduated college, finished their college experience when we moved to Falls Church, because it has a lot to offer other than solely a school system. And you don't want to damage that attractiveness as we convert ourselves into more school-centric education. With all due respect, Dr. Noonan, having sat through 4 years of budget discussions, every time it's the same story. Life on Earth will end as we know it if we don't get the funding we need for this or that program. It never changes. It's the same story over again. Why this one is more credible, I give you credit, probably have more credibility than others, but it's not a story that's brand new to many of the citizens in this room. As regards the 3.1 or 3.2 million estimate, for the tax yield. That is a reasonable estimate if you compare it to what other projects have taken place. So I don't really have, and I and John Lamoni had spoken to the people who did the model. We had a long technical discussion with Tischler and I think it was Carson Bice about the issue, and we understand, and the numbers, we quibbled, but make sense. So I think the 3.2 is no more conservative than a 4% growth in school operating costs and other things that could end up costing us much more. That is, those two tables should be there so that people understand what is going to happen in the future and what will our tax bill. Dr. Noonan, when you talked about property values, again, this is a long-standing argument. I have mathematically or arithmetically demonstrated that, in fact, many people need the schools as a type of mortgage protection agent. It's mortgage protection insurance, because if you paid false church prices for your house and you paid for the school system, you now can't afford to have any dip in the housing values without running the risk of going underwater. So underneath the educational component is a very real financial need to maintain that, and many people are willing to pay what it takes to maintain that. But if you happen to own your house, it's a different story. If you just moved here and you have a large mortgage, the arithmetic plays out in a completely different way. I'll spare you the details on that. But I have to repeat, without those additional tables, the citizens of Falls Church are not being given the full picture of what this school expansion means going forward for all the taxpayers, not just on the tables on the CIP. And appreciate all the work that went into them, but as a finance person myself, there is a point where we get precision without accuracy. So it's very precise, but it really doesn't provide the level of information that an informed citizen needs to have in order to decide. Information is effectively being withheld from the citizens. This should be made public so everybody knows what they're buying into, and if they approve it and everything's known, the rating agencies won't have a problem because everybody will have signed on to something that they're fully aware of. If not, there could be an issue.
Can I just chime in? Thank you, Mr. Kalin. It was nice to meet you sort of unofficially here. First of all, Mr. Shields, thanks for mentioning Fairfax as a example, I think, of something that worked out really well. I don't know if everybody here knows, but I served as superintendent in the city of Fairfax for the last 5 years, and I had an opportunity there to do a lot of this work sort of at the tail end with the city. And I'm pretty sure that the original bonds that were let in the city of Fairfax were 30-year level debt bonds that were refinanced following. So that may be something we can follow up on.
Yeah, that is accurate. But I will concede the point. I think we all prefer 20-year debt. And but in terms of the affordability question, I think it's something that we all probably can relate to. I mean, I'd rather have a 15-year mortgage and be done with that mortgage in 15 years, but I structured it as a 30-year to make it more affordable. I pay more over the 30 years, but it's not an entirely dissimilar calculation here. We will pay more over the life of the debt, but it is a lower payment, obviously in the early years. Yeah.
Kieran Sharp, 408 Southwest Street. I'd also like to say that there are published documents that indicate that the Fairfax City debt was a 30-year bonding for the schools in 2005. They also refinanced those bonds in 2013. You can find those documents on the internet. They're official publications of Fairfax City for their annual review of their auditing, and the same procedure that we go through for auditing here. I would also suggest that 30-year bonds could be well received by those who are in the investment community for our other projects, because the capacity of the city to afford its debt has to do much more with the ongoing ability of the city to produce revenue than it does with the city's particular position as to the reserves that it may have. And that's also been attested by, and again, you can find public documents on this, that there's been a change in the standards that have to apply for the banks as they review their purchases of municipal bonds. They must look much more carefully at the ability of the municipality to generate revenue than at the reserves that the municipality may have to back them up. Thank you.
Hi, Eileen Williams, 406 West Rosemary Lane. We've lived in the city now about 23 years and have seen numerous projects, developments, mixed use go up with predictions of estimate to total pupil population. And in numerous projects, the estimate was under, and the population of the school increased. Any additions that may have been made were already over, I don't want to say stuffed with pupils, but the estimates were under. And I'm looking at this page here, and they're basically 15 to 20% estimates are lower than the actual effect to the school population. And I'm looking at the land development assumptions for when the Alvarez and Marcel predict for the multifamily and plus 55 multifamily. You've got almost 970 additional units going up. Does the plan for the new high school and whatever is going to be done to TJ going to really reflect 20% more than what you've been given for numbers in the past? Will they accommodate, the new schools accommodate 20% over whatever anybody has predicted? Because it's happened in the past.
It's a great question, and it certainly is one of those that makes us a little bit nervous as we're thinking about particularly the high school. What we do know, and sort of looking inside of the black box of Weldon Cooper, and some of the work that we've done previously with respect to projections in my previous district, was looking at what is the student yield by size of unit and age of unit. And what we know is that the average yield of a brand new unit, whether it's 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, typically is going to be much less than what the yield is of an older unit. And the line of demarcation typically is about 1986. So construction pre-1986 tends to yield more students than newer construction. All that means, though, is that as this new construction is being built, over the next 30 years of the life of that new construction, we may end up yielding more students than we anticipate right at the beginning. So when I say that we're looking at a high school that will build capacity for the next 30 years, I would anticipate that we're going to be closer to 80%, 85% utilization rate of that building by about 2030, 2035. And as the population increases, we can continue to utilize that building differently. But if you look at the slides that, and we'll make sure that everybody gets those, there is some room for an addition on the high school if that's needed. There's also room for an addition at Mary Ellen Henderson if that's needed. And then we are still talking about the addition at Thomas Jefferson. But I wouldn't anticipate needing to do an addition at the high school after this construction for at least 20 to 25 years. I think the building can handle it. a long-winded answer. Sorry.
And one thing I will add on the projection side, because we track this so closely now, what the chart that you have in your hand, as well as the smaller chart where it shows where our pupils are coming from for all of our housing types, that's what now goes into the models that has produced the projections that I referred to earlier in the tonight's meeting.
I'm still Leslie Rye of 214 Lawton. I remembered my second comment. Along in Fairfax County and Loudoun County, along the Dulles Toll Road, along the Silver Line Metro, the commercial real estate gets special taxes that were approved by the state. Is the city considering anything like that for this development?
It is a possibility. And so that could be structured as a community development authority or a special taxing district. And that would have the virtue potentially of generating extra revenue that would go for the high school. There are issues with that. If we would lay that out up front in our solicitation, and so that will have an impact on value. And so these are just pros and cons that we'll navigate, and we'll do that in a competitive way so that we get good information in terms of what's the best structure for the city.
Hi, it's Laura Downs at 211 Midvale Street, putting on my elementary PTA hat. Just a question for Dr. Noonan about TJ. So we talked about that looking at down the road and another addition to TJ. And I think most everyone knows in the room that we were hoping to move second grade to Mount Daniel. Now we're not so sure because we had to scale down the Mount Daniel project. And I know there's been talk about whether it's second grade or keeping second grade at TJ, moving Jesse Thackeray preschool to Mount Daniel. But putting that aside, I guess my thought is, TJ is already pretty much at capacity. So now we're talking 5 to 8 years for a TJ expansion. So if we are past capacity in the next few years, will we be putting more trailers at TJ, or what's the plan?
That's a great question. At this point in time, I don't anticipate doing anything with the students at Jesse Thackeray and leaving Thackeray as a preschool. I think we, from what I understand, we worked really hard to get that school site there with the community and would like to maintain a standalone preschool. As Mount Daniel comes online and finishes in the fall of next year, it does appear, if kind of going back to the numbers and the projections, if the projections are right, we would be able to potentially move the second graders to Mount Daniel for that time frame, during which we could then plan for a new addition at Thomas Jefferson that would ultimately take care of the trailers that are there, put the new addition on, handle the capacity there, and also be able to move the second grade back. So that is sort of the timing and the time frame. I will say it's one of those things that keeps me up at night because I think it's going to be nip and tuck in terms of numbers of students at Mount Daniel with the second graders there, and also being cognizant of the restrictions that were put on us by Fairfax County in terms of the number of 660 students.
Hello, I'm Mark Quay from 413 Lincoln, and I know tonight is talk about capital costs, not operating costs, but I find it hard to make a decision about, undergoing this bit, biting off all this debt without understanding the implications to operating costs. And my concern is that, Mr. Shields, you say the tax growth for the next 10 years, the city can expect about 2.5%. Dr. Noonan, you say you need 4%. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, just a 1.5 delta, but since we're talking with big numbers and compounding interest, it's huge. I mean, if you're worried about borrowing $7 million or paying back $7 million a year for the $120 million bond, I mean, the deficit to the school on operating costs exceeds that by year 4. By year 10, it's like $15 million, assuming that you get your 2.5% and 51% of that goes to the school. I mean, the real issue, I think, is addressing the operating costs and the two projections. Why don't we talk about that?
I think everybody in the community should understand that if we take on these capital obligations, there will have to be discipline on the operating budgets. And so what does that mean?
Right there, you should tell him, not
Okay.
me.
Well, I mean, I think it's true we've got city capital projects as well. And so in our discussions with city employees about making investments in City Hall, making investments in the library, these are going to increase, these are going to have debt service associated with them. And that's going to impact our operating budgets. And that certainly is going to be true with the school budgets as well.
And to be clear, what I did put out was a 10-year projection of 4% based on the last 10 years. Doesn't necessarily mean that's what we need, but we needed to put something out there to say this is what it looks like it could be. As I said in my original presentation this evening, we are committed on the school side to constrain operating costs as best we can, because we know that we are putting a strain on the budget with the new high school, and we'll work very hard to make that happen. Can't stop the kids from coming, though. That's the one wild card in this, is when the kids come, we do have to pay for them.
Wyatt, John Coleman on Lawton Street, been here for about 35 plus years. When do you anticipate that the citizens will know whether you're looking at the full CIP or the moderate CIP? And secondly, a technical question on the library. The citizens have already approved that bond, but it's my understanding that the bond has not gone out, that we have not received any money for that. Does that go on ad infinitum? I mean, does that eventually need to be put before the citizens again to approve the library?
That's a good question. Under state law, if we were a county, counties have a bond referendum requirement under state law, and the city doesn't have that state law provision. What we have is a local policy that says capital expenditures that are over 10% of the annual budget go to the voters, with some exceptions. And so if we were a county under state law, we'd have 8 years after a referendum to execute the project, or maybe to begin the project. As the city, I think we could probably follow that rule of thumb, even though that's not an explicit law under, in the same way that it would be for a county. So 8 years, I think, is a good operating time frame.
And could you just do the reminder of when council will make a decision on full and modified?
A real purpose of this town hall meeting is for the council to hear your comments and your questions. The council does have this on the agenda for next Monday, the 24th. And so the council will adopt a CIP that'll either be the full CIP or be the modified CIP or some version in between. And from that, then we take our direction as staff then to implement the projects as set forth by the city council. But one thing I will add is that all these decisions are progressive, and the CIP is simply one decision in a process. And so, for instance, for the high school project, this is a CIP decision. Then there's a referendum decision. Then there are many budget decisions that follow after that. And ultimately, the council also has to take a formal action to allow the authorization or the resolution when the bonds are issued that sets forth the terms of those bonds. So there are multiple bites at the apple, but the CIP is a really important part of the planning process.
Yeah, hi, Jeff Peterson, 205 Tyson Drive. Jeff Peterson, 205 Tyson Drive. You mentioned the RFP for the 10 acres at the site and a development plan. Given the significant difference between on the tax rate of the development and then without the development, and the uncertainty related to how that will all play out, why does the city not proceed with making that deal on the 10 acres to get a confident sense of what we're going to get in terms of a sale and probably better sense of the revenue before trying to go to the citizens for a referendum on one amount that assumes that there is no sale, if we could be going back for a much more confident lower amount.
We could do that. In fact, in a respect, we did do that with that initial RFP that was issued. And what we got back were very safe, and the market didn't respond very well to that. And they also didn't want to take a lot of risks because they knew there was a long process before anything was going to happen, including a voted referendum. So by sequencing it this way of first seeing that the capital project has authorization to proceed, then the market knows that we're serious when we go with their solicitation, and we'll get, we think, a much healthier response. We'll get much more creative responses. And we also think we'll get some responses that might be more risky on the market side. Whereas if there's all the risk is still outstanding, that the market's not going to take on more risk than they can bear. So that's some of the reasoning why the sequencing is the way it is. What our intention will be, however, is that while the school, if the referendum passes, that while the school is in engineering and design, which will take over a year, that's when we'll do our procurement process for the land, and we would have a master development promulgated and executed before we issue the first tranche of the big bonds for construction for the school. Now, there still is a period of risk that in between that period of time where we have that agreement signed and executed, there'll be 2 years of construction before the developer can take possession of the land and break ground. We'll use that 2-year period of time to go through all the entitlement process and work out the final details on the private development. But if there's a market turn in that 2-year period, that's where we have some risk. Now, there's some ways that we're going to try to manage that, and we think there are some ways that we can manage that. But that's a period of time that is kind of important for the whole project, I guess I would say.
I think there's also some timing for the need of the school tied to the timing of proceeding with the school now while we wait for the economic development.
It's Sharon Scholler again, 1006 North Tuckahoe Street. I'm looking at the mixed-use development fiscal impact report, and there are some very large numbers under the primary voluntary concessions. From Lincoln at Tinner Hill, it's over $1.5 million. From West Broad, it's over $2 million. And then from Northgate, it's $820,000. And they say this is for the schools. And I'm just wondering when that money comes in and how that money will be used or can be used to defray some of the costs.
All the dollars that are shown on that chart have been received, and they've all been spent for the schools. The largest ones came from 301 West Broad and from the Lincoln project, and they are paying for about 1/3 of the cost of Mount Daniel. And so $4.2 million of the Mount Daniel cost is being paid for out of developer proffers.
A new person in the back. He was deferring to a new person.
Maybe just so for people can sort of prepare, why don't we intend to go until 9:30, if that's acceptable, and then we'll remain here for any additional follow-up questions. If there's a whole lot of hands up, then we'll keep going, but that's a basic idea.
Oh, yeah, hi. Joyce Galovich. I'm at 209 Great Falls Street. It's more of comments than questions. When you're mentioning Fairfax City, I understand Fairfax City contracts out to the county for their school. I imagine people don't want to hear about it, but it does come up is let's consolidate with Fairfax County or Arlington County. The other thought, too, is I don't want to see my taxes go up, but when you're doing something like this, you want a new school and their the library and City Hall. taxes will go up. At the same time, I'm one always griping about the roads. School buses use these roads daily. School's got to help us pay for these roads, which aren't getting done. It's a big mess down here at Little Falls and Great Falls. So I'd like to see the city do more on repaving our roads. A thought too, if we're going to build, not if we're going to build, but the idea of a new school, and it seems then too, if you're having this big group over at TJ, a number of students there that would be filtering into Mary Henderson, is that going to have the capability to handle the students that are transferring them from TJ over there? And what are we going to be looking at there? And if the idea of building this new high school, I'd just like to see it to be a nice campus up there for the middle school and the high school students. And the thought that the doctor had mentioned perhaps would even have to use the fields to put trailers. I mean, the city spent a lot of money to get those fields and everything else, and the back nut drop there for baseball and softball. And don't build more parking. Let the kids use the school buses. Let their parents drop them off. Let them walk, carpool. You build more parking spots, there are going to be more students wanting to drive. A thought that is just make it a nice campus for the students. And the idea of this 10 acres, I guess I just have to see it, but it sounds like it's going to be, I don't know, a lot of congestion going on over there. And why give that up? And then where's the safety factor? And a lot of the students like to go to Giant afterwards and this sort of thing, crossing the streets. So I imagine there's going to be a buffer back there that nobody from the commercial can get into city or the high school property. Someone mentioned the entrance would be from Route 7. So, I mean, this commercial stuff, it really sounds like it's just going to be a mess up there and congestion. And I can see the school is going to need more space, and then you give it away or you sell it or lease it out. And then where do we go? It's like years ago, they gave away all these schools, and now you're looking for property. Where do we put the schools? So I'm not for these outrageous taxes going up in this system, but if you're talking about building schools, a new school and everything, just keep it a nice school campus. They have a nice one over at Langley. They don't have enough room over there. Woodson is a beautiful campus over there, even Fairfax, and they're off from the main roads, and we're up there, and you're going to put more commercial and more traffic congestion, whatever. It's just my thought. Anyway, I'm all for consolidating. Thank you for listening.
Is there any response that's... Oh, I'll assume there's nothing.
I'm happy to respond to some of those pieces. I appreciate your time coming out tonight and your thoughts. First and foremost, you are right that Fairfax City does contract with Fairfax County for their operations. The city is still responsible for all of their capital costs, and their operational costs for students is not significantly different in terms of their per pupil cost than it is here in the city of Falls Church. The city of Fairfax pays nearly $15,000 a student to operate their schools to Fairfax County. So I think there's a case to be made to stay independent. And while I was in the city of Fairfax, one of the things that I was looking at was Falls Church to see how we might be able to move away from some of that contracting, because the efficiencies in many cases weren't actually getting us the benefit that we were looking for. So that's a whole nother story for another day. You know, if you have some concerns about the buses and wear and tear on the roads, certainly happy to engage in that conversation. If you'll send me an email, I can work with the city staff and figure out where some of those spots are. plan that we've adopted, the school board has adopted, is the community school model. And it does separate functionally the commercial development from the school by a field. And it would be a use field that would be for the schools, and then after hours could be used by the community as well. But it would be a large field. I think the design, the conceptual design that's been prepared for us is superior to Langley, to Woodson, and dare I say even Fairfax, because it's a brand new building and it's not a renovation, and those 3 schools are all renovated schools. This would give us an opportunity, I think, in many ways to break through and to do some really beautiful work, not only architecturally, but also look at some of the infrastructures and systems that would actually help overall operating costs down the line. For example, looking at geothermal, we would be able to then engage in a geothermal process to heat and cool the building that over time would ultimately bring down some of the operational costs. It is a more, I could go on and I won't too much longer, but I will say this, and that is that when we look at the ed specifications of buildings, meaning what are the spaces that are designated for certain kinds of operations within the building, whether it's classroom instruction, media centers, cafeterias, conference rooms, flexible spaces. Even in renovations at Woodson, Langley, and Fairfax, we don't have any of those spaces that are available like we could get in a brand new construction, and this gives us the flexibility to get some of those 21st century spaces that we aren't able to achieve in other buildings. So I think we can really do something special. It's not going to be a school up on a hill, separated from Route 7 or from the commercial, but we can certainly create some buffer areas that create some sense of separation and safety, and I think that field, that in between in that community model does that. So hopefully that's responsive to some of your questions and comments, but thank you.
Ira Kalin at the same address as the previous intervention. Couple of things. One, I stand corrected about the 30 years in Fairfax, but I did call Arlington, I called Alexandria, I called Fairfax Central Office, and I called Loudoun County Central Office. And I was told at that time that it was 20 years flat principal. Whether that was giving incorrect information to me, may have been, but that's what I did. And Wyatt will attest that I'm very careful in the numbers and the things I present as facts. Very careful. And that was what I was told when I called up the central offices. The other thing is, Wyatt, this is for you. Basically, are you going to add operating costs? And if you're not, may I ask, who authorized the elimination of operating costs from the overall presentation to the residents of the city? Who authorized it to be excluded?
Well, one thing I just want to say, which I should have said in response to part of your first question, I think everyone here should know that a lot of the reason why the city actually has decent financial capacity today is because of Mr. Kalin's work on the Budget and Finance Committee of shoring up the city's capital reserves, shoring up its overall financial condition, advocating for the full funding of the pensions, which in terms of how outsiders look at the city's finances, we are in good shape because of the work that you did. In terms of operating budgets, I would just say this. We were trying to provide a very clear picture as to what the capital costs are. Now, operating costs, we do multi-year projections, and it always looks like alligator jaws. And that's just what you do when you do multi-year projections. You consider all your potential expenses, and they're higher than what your revenue projections are. And that's the way it is. Every year, what the budget process is the process of closing those alligator jaws, and either done through reductions in spending or through requests for increases in taxes. And that's an annual process. That doesn't mean you shouldn't look at it on a multi-year basis to understand what are the big cost drivers so that you can plan for them. I would suggest this, however, though, that just as an empty exercise of trying to do operating forecasts, it's just a game of assumptions. But if it's driven by a policy imperative, which is to say, suppose from a policy directive that there was going to be a revenue sharing agreement with the schools, then we would do these multi-year forecasts to say, okay, well, what does that mean? What is that likely to mean? What are likely to be the tension points if we were to have a multi-year agreement on revenue sharing? Or if there is a multi-year tax plan that the council articulated with the capital plan to say, okay, we're going to do these capital projects, but in addition to that, we're going to set forward some guidelines in terms of what operating budgets are going to have to be for the next 5 years as part of this package of capital improvements programs. Then the operating forecasting exercise becomes very real and meaningful because you're doing it in a policy context. And we've had many discussions over the years about revenue sharing agreements or that type of a thing. We've never reached the point of having those types of agreements. But I do think that a period of time when the city is taking on many very significant long-term obligations, and most significantly for a high school, I think it's a good time for those types of multi-year discussions and maybe multi-year agreements between the school board and the city council. Well, I will say that I was not directed to include operating costs in the forecast. So it was a decision that I made with our finance director on how best to try to explain to the public what the costs of the capital program are.
Benjamin Kong, 444 West Broad Street. Early in your presentation, I think you had laid out the costs, the urgently needed costs like HVAC and replacing the roof if the referendum wasn't approved for a new high school. Did you do any planning about how that would be funded? How that roughly $20 million would be funded?
It's my understanding from our operations team on the school side that has been part of the CIP planning process previous to tonight. So I think that's been brought up, but I'm not sure where it falls in the CIP currently. So I would need to get that information and bring it back.
That has been discussed and needs identified, but it is not currently in the CIP or the proposed one before because the planning is for the new school. If the new school doesn't pass the referendum or it's not put in the CIP, then there'd have to be another CIP review to add in and discuss a $20 million project versus $120 million.
Thank you for taking that.
This is more of an observation also, is that you're talking about a new school, but I want to think about teachers also, because we've heard a lot about keeping our salaries for teachers competitive, which I think is really important, and also class sizes. So I don't know if that's included in your operating cost projections, but I just want to say that I don't want to forget about that cost as well.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think those are part of the assumptions within that operating cost, though.
John Lamoni, 304 Great Falls Street. I understand what you're saying about operating costs, but in fact, you have a projection of operating costs. The chart on full CIP debt service has implicitly in it an operating cost year by year. Can we have those operating costs and the rate of growth of those operating costs? Can those be made public? You had to have them to calculate that.
Yeah, and there's a very simple answer to that question. The assumption is a 2.5% annual growth plus the debt service. So that's why it's not just a slope, a line with a slope of 2.5%. It's you tack in the increase in debt service. So what that means, though, is that for the purposes of debt service modeling, 2.5% is actually less than what our annual growth of expenditures has been for the history of the city. So in the context of capital forecasting, that's actually a conservative number, because otherwise that slope would be steeper. And so you would actually have more room under your policy for capital spending. So that's how the 2.5% functions in the context of this exercise. Right, but in terms of whether it means I think we're going to stay at 2.5%, or that means that the schools need to stay at 2.5 and general government needs to stay at 2.5, that's not what that assumption necessarily means. What that assumption does is just sets the slope of that line. Well, I will say this. I mean, I'm not trying to minimize the importance of operating budgets. I think they're hugely important, and I think that this big capital discussion, these are the most important decisions the city's going to make for a generation. I do think it's an opportunity for there to be a really good discussion about level of service and cost of government in the city, and I think that's a healthy thing to talk about. So in that context, operating budgets, are important. Now, I will say, modeling them out for 5 years, I'm skeptical of the efficacy of it, because the truth of the matter is we're no good at modeling budgets on a 12-month basis. Every year we're off by percentage points. But nonetheless, in a policy context of a discussion between the city council and the school board and the community about what expectations should be in terms of level of service and level of budget growth, this is a good time to have that discussion. So I think that we're at 9:35, and so we will stay here to answer any other questions and continue the discussion, but we'll break for the formal part of this meeting. Let me ask Mayor Tarter, did you have any closing remarks or any amendments to anything I've said, or
have a good evening, everyone. Thank you very much.
You want to? No.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Yep.